Hello, story seekers. I'm Ben.
I'm Nico, and you're listening to our favourite part of the week.
Stories, discussion, and a high likelihood of gratuitous obscenities, all in the service of a bibliomancer. This is the Tiny Bookcase.
Regular listeners will know how it works, but for newcomers, Ben and I have both written a story to the same shared prompt.
We're about to share those stories with each other and you for the first time, and we'll be workshopping them on mic. The prompt for this episode is boundaries, and Nico, you'll be reading first.
Elias walked the perimeter, just as he had the day before, and the 10,000 days before that. Nothing had ever changed on his route at any time that he could remember, save the grooves of his repeated passage deepening. The dry prints were worn so deep it was like stepping from one pair of shoes to the next. A mercy, since his boots had so long ago worn through and eventually disintegrated into nothing. He still had a flap of the tongue from the left boot. It sat rolled in his pocket, just in case. Elias did a lot of things, just in case. Nothing ever changed here, but if it did, he wanted to be prepared for it. It was the only description he would be able to manage thus far. The imagination had withered faster than his boots. As he walked, he reached his left hand into the air and felt resistance there, as he always did. For the first few months here, he had pressed against that invisible barrier for hours. He'd thumped at a section of air that looked no different from the one he was breathing, until his fingers were twisted and purple. The bloodstains had stayed there for a while, floating against the nothingness. A grim reminder of his seeming incarceration. There had been no transgression in his memory. Elias had just woken here, and that seemed to be all of it. He didn't remember anywhere before this place, nor could he create anything in his mind that differed from it. The once beautiful vistas that painted the horizon, eternally out of reach, were all he could see in the eye of his mind. So he walked until he fell and slept. Then he did the same again, and again, and again. The rhythmic padding of his footfalls seemed a part of the natural world now, an expected heartbeat of this eternal countryside. He had sung with the beat once. Now he'd been alone for so long that he was uncertain he could even manage to remember words. The sun was high, which meant it was hot. He was 1,372 steps from the river. He would become cool there. He pressed onwards, counting the steps down as he went. He'd measured the whole journey once. Over time he'd laid markers, stones that stood 1,000 steps apart. They were like old friends now. He didn't need them. Every detail of the place was memorized, in vivid, painful accuracy. Those 1,000-odd steps went swiftly enough, and Elias soon found himself half submerged in the clear blue water. He allowed his back to rest against the invisible barrier and the water to run over him. It had driven him near to madness that the water seemed to run through unhindered. He'd once waded the full length of the river, wondering if he might find the mountain it stemmed from, instead meeting resistance on the other side and seeing the water flow lazily in from some unknown place. Of course, now that was all just another part of his little world. Ample space, he might have called it, in another life. One perhaps with company. He lowered his head under the water and let the fluid soak into his hair and the remainder of his clothes. He'd be dry enough soon, once he'd drunk his fill and continued his walk. It wouldn't be long before a meal arrived, with the sun where it was. They always came at the same time, some hours after the sun had peaked, always along his path but never exactly where he was. He'd been mistrusting at first, but before long the threat of starvation had led him to eat, and now it was just where food came from. As he held his head under, a thought came, which in and of itself was unusual. What if I never came back up? Would it be so dreadful to be dead instead of this? He barely recognized the voice in his head, even though it was his own. It scared him somewhat, but the voice went on. It would be simple. It wouldn't take long. I'd be free. Freedom did sound nice. The next day he began his walk again. Every 1,000 steps he stooped to pick a smooth, stony friend and place them into his pocket. There were 57 of these to be gathered as he walked the ring. With time, he began to feel the strangeness of the additional weight on him and began labouring under so much additional mass. He left behind the just-in-case things that had plagued him for so long. The tongue of his boot fell into a deep, worn footprint as he made space for more stones. 2 full days it took to complete this thing and gather every marker stone. Now here he was again, at the river. Gently he waded in and let the water soak him. It was cooling as always, especially with how tired he was. Gently he knelt in the water and felt his pockets laden heavy with his only friends. The markers pulled at him, and he willed the weight of 1,000 steps into each. Gently he lay back and let his friends drag him to the bottom of the shallow water. Through the strange blue fog of it, he watched the world that had owned him so long from a new perspective. For the first time in his memory, he smiled and then laughed, pulling the river into him and allowing him to rest. Oh no! Elias is dead! Cosmic being Zandaklalon had peeled away the lid of the great terrarium to drop food in, as he always did once home from school. His little pet human had drowned itself. They were simple animals, he knew that, but that seemed really dumb. Dad was going to kill him. You look after that human, he'd said. They're very bloody expensive. Sadly, Zandaklalon reached in and lifted the tiny body out in the palm of his hand. Elias had always seemed a bit sad, he thought, walking around the edge of his enclosure like that. Maybe humans were born to be free. He held Elias delicately in one hand as he turned off the river's pump and flicked off the sun lamp. With a final, sad look at his pet, he went down to the kitchen. He'd need a coffee tin or something to bury him in.
Oh, what an unpleasant concept that is.
Yeah.
It's yeah, okay. So it's quite an interesting one to workshop, that, isn't it? Because you've obviously got the what's effectively a punchline.
Yes.
With the alien reveal. And I like this idea of like a human terrarium. Like, it reminds me very much of almost like a Futurama episode or something like that. You know, that
Yeah, I
kind
can
of
see
like
that.
and I have a lot of time for that kind of amusing but terrifying SF. It feels like one that did you find this in the writing of it? If that
So
makes
yeah, well,
sense.
it started as I mean, it took ages to find the right concept for this one for boundaries. I
Mm.
really struggled, but it started with him as an kind of like a video game NPC,
Yeah,
and you know, you get those invisible walls in games when you're not meant to be able to get to the next bit,
yeah,
and
yeah,
being
yeah.
stuck in that kind of liminal space, and then the idea of him being a pet. I started thinking about, what does he eat? Where does that come from?
So
And
this is truly bizarre because I nearly wrote that story 3 prompts ago.
really,
Yeah, with this idea of like video game characters realizing that they're being controlled by like a neck bearded twat.
oh wow,
So and I basically it was basically a draw of the straw, like which way I went on that particular prompt, and I went a different way with it. So this is that's particularly amusing to me because it clearly we're on a very similar wavelength
oh
creatively.
yeah,
So that makes sense.
fascinating.
Why do you think you found, just because obviously the prompt is boundaries? Why have you figured out why you found that particularly challenging?
I don't know. I think it's almost too broad without feeling like there's a lot of scope for expression.
Okay.
So boundaries can be. I had loads of ideas, and in a big way, a lot of like gags, like a lot of punchlines, a lot of jokes, but nothing that felt like it had a whole story in it.
Yeah, that's a tricky
Like,
feeling. It's one that I
yeah,
do know, because we do occasionally just catch a prompt that just goes sideways on us fairly quickly
yeah,
in the process, and I still haven't ever quite found an answer to the question that I just asked you. Like, you'd have thought that we would really at this stage be experts on which prompts are going to work and which prompts aren't going to work, but
yeah.
I think there's just a lot of factors at play here. So,
Yeah, a lot of it's got to be external as well. If you've got
mm,
things that you're trying to figure out, or you're working on stuff like I've been quite busy with band stuff because we've got an album coming up, and so a lot of that headspace, I think it can be difficult to sort of open the door that your ideas are behind, and sometimes it's the wrong shaped key for the door, so it takes a
absolutely,
bit longer to kick it through instead of just opening it.
yeah. Well, I mean, from like a workshopping perspective, I think I always like your writing and stuff, but I feel like this is the first story for a while that needs quite a lot of work.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
I,
fair.
and it sounds like you're on board with that. Like
Oh yeah,
yeah, it's a thing. So like 10,000 days is 27 years.
yeah,
Um, and obviously time would pass differently for the kid that he's the pet of. Um, but that's an awfully long time from a human perspective to be trapped with
yeah.
no sensory stimuli at all. And obviously we reach the point where he quite logically commits suicide in a way because there's just no way out in any possible way out of this
Yeah.
for him. Um, I bit of a Virginia Woolf reference as well, I think, with the stones in the pocket,
Yeah.
going in the river. Yeah, I like. Well, I was going to say I liked that, but it actually just made me
Big
feel
fan of
uncomfortable.
that.
Yeah, big fan of that particular method of suicide. Um, no, it's just obviously she I think she'd already attempted suicide a couple of times before she was. I don't know whether the word is successful, but what actually ended up dead as a result
Yeah.
of a suicide attempt. And that was a question that it actually made me ask myself after you mentioned the stones, because I love this idea of the boundary stones being every 1,000 steps, and those being the stones that he then uses to kill himself.
Yeah.
But why isn't he dead already after 27 years? Like, the answer to that question, I think, is fairly key because if you can answer that question with something that ties into the punchline, like if there's something that's changed in the situation
Yeah.
outside of his control that would give the audience a chance at uh, having a bit of an aha moment
Okay. Yeah.
when
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
revealed, that could work really well for you, I think, in this story. Um, and I think certainly you could get some words back if you need some words to like as in if you need some more words to do that in. I think you could get some words back at the start of your story by
Could
getting to the barrier faster.
could be interesting to have him. So maybe he has over the years like built a home and made himself a living space,
Yeah.
and then they clean the terrarium out, and his
Ooh.
whole life is suddenly whipped away, and that's
Yes.
why he starts walking.
That's it. That's it. You got
I
it.
think that's the hook, isn't it?
Yep. The line "one perhaps with company" was quite heartrending, wasn't it?
Yeah.
This idea that he potentially is quite a pithy individual, but there's no one there to share that with.
Yeah.
It's really horrid. I was also reminded of I recently went to a fairly large zoo in England, um, and zoos are a bit of a complicated one, aren't they? Because
They
there's
are.
all kinds of animal welfare sentiments and feelings and facts around them, and there's also some conservation stuff that happens only through zoos and the fact that they
Yeah,
are
they
profitable.
do a lot for the conservation of species,
Yeah, and
but it's the 50 quid a ticket and then
yeah,
paying out your ass for ice cream stuff that makes that feel a bit gauche.
potentially, but also if you are funding
But yeah,
I don't know,
you
it
got to
would
pay for the animals to eat, and
yeah,
yeah, this is why they're a complicated issue.
it's extremely complicated, but fundamentally, I think we are in a stage, at least in England, where our zoos have to be up to a certain standard, otherwise they aren't allowed to exist. At least that's my hope. But even at what's supposed to be a very nice zoo, I went to the one in London, big one.
Yeah,
Uh, I went to the tiger exhibit where they have clear. I don't know whether it's plexiglass or some kind of bulletproof glass or something, but it's they have a glass boundary around the
yeah,
tiger enclosure, and the tigers were going nowhere near that bit. But instead, I found one around the back, towards where there was like an entrance that was more sort of like fence and cage like,
yeah,
and it was just pacing back and forth, just dead eyeing me. And I was looking at something that had been driven mad by incarceration, and it was not a nice feeling.
yeah,
I don't know whether I was projecting that. I probably was, but it seemed like this thing just going round and round in circles. This giant, majestic beast. It was just wrong, and I think you captured that in this story.
I'm glad a lot of it stems from because I do worry about that stuff. Like even
Yeah.
I have a cat, and we go out to work, and I think, oh, well, she's lonely in the day, and that's a few hours.
Mm,
And I think about people who have pets on their own, and especially like pets that need company, like rats or a lot of rodents need to have at least one other of their species there, otherwise they just very quickly go mad.
yeah.
And I think we're very similar. People are very much like that.
Yeah. I mean that does bring up, like, in a certain way, I am sort of against people having those kinds of pets.
Yeah,
For that very reason. Um, I do feel like some, like an animal, like a dog or something. They have been, conditioned and bred and all the rest of it to really enjoy human company, and
yeah,
so I can sort of see that. But an animal that's still mostly wild, like a cat, I've never fully um, understood the concept of keeping them at home. But when they're very young, like your cat is, like, you've got to, otherwise they're going to get trampled by a car. Like, that's just
yeah,
going to happen, especially if you're in a city. Um, Fascinating. So yeah, I think it's all there. I just think at the moment it's like it reads like you're finding out for yourself.
yeah,
And I think with a couple of passes of an edit and drilling down into what the crux of the story is, where the turn is, etc. I think you can make that into an absolute banger, as per usual for you.
yeah. I think it's either having them sort of clear away the home he's made for himself, or introducing another human, but a male.
Mm.
So a rival male that then kills him or he kills.
I think I prefer the man versus environment
Yeah,
than man versus man idea, because the environment is where the central point of your story is, isn't it? This
yeah,
sort of science fiction terrarium. Um, but that's not to say that there isn't a way down with the man versus man thing. But people versus environment is always a fairly terrifying prospect, I think. Just
yeah,
before we move on, like,
yeah,
the one element of your story which I really liked and I think you handled really well and probably doesn't need to be touched is this idea of the just in case things.
yes,
That was really nice. I think most people will be able to identify with the anxiety that leads to accruing just random tat and crap that is,
I better
just
not
in
throw that
case.
away. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that. And this idea that we know that he is going to commit suicide because he starts getting rid of these things.
yeah,
He starts getting rid of the stones that he's been using as a measurement system, which really is a method of controlling his environment, isn't it?
yeah,
Or trying to understand his environment. And then, the bit of his boots that have worn away to nothing, and the other just in case things. It's just, it's, yeah. I like the idea of it being his home.
yeah,
Um, because those are the things that mean something to him, whereas the things that he's carrying with him are the things for just in case, aren't they? Like, they could be the things that he might use just in case he can escape, just in case he gets out and doesn't have
yeah.
time to go back to his house. Um, I There's clearly stuff there because it's really set me alight a bit.
Yeah, I think it.
Yeah.
I think it shows in there that I struggled with the prompt because I didn't have the time, or rather, didn't allow myself the time because of my struggle to get that story as far along as it needed to be.
Mm, yeah.
And yeah, there was definitely I sort of finally found an idea that's got some legs to it, but without the without giving myself ample time to
It happens. I've done it
get it
before.
all out.
I've done it before, and it's just a thing. You are great at this, and that's the only reason that it stands out for me because it's all there. It's just potentially not in the right order yet.
And it's a big part of the learning process as well. Like you're not
Mhm.
going to sit down every single time and go, "Yep, that's a story. That's a great one," because sometimes you're just going to go, "Do you know what? I didn't land that one. I'll write something else," and that's
Yeah,
just part of how it is.
it's the way it is. But also, I like the fact that you knew it. You knew you'd struggled with it and still performed it because I think that
Yeah,
that's a side of things that we do need to show. So I agree. Also, having given you such quite intense feedback there, it's very difficult to now go ahead and read mine. But I'm gonna do it anyway. But I feel like mine now has to be bulletproof because I've given you such feedback there.
well, I'll start loading now.
You just start loading, preload it for me because I want you to
Perfect.
punch it up.
Right, story me up, Daddy.
Boundaries. My father had died on New Year's Day. He had spoken of wanting to go back home to Dalma towards the end, but had been unable to secure the flight pass and was already too unwell to risk crossing the Atlantic. Frustrated, he had instead nattered incessantly about all the strange people he had known there, and the oddities in those stories had gnawed at me. The bookcases of the locals were supposedly filled with unique volumes, books that changed the world, he had said, whilst fear and regret fought to dominate his voice. Books he would have chosen to read had he known his life would be cut short. Despite my efforts over the years to leave copies around his house, he had, to my knowledge, never read any of my books. I reached Dulmer 2 months later, having arrived by ship in Liverpool and then crept up the coast on a suspensionless bus to the village. Had my work visa been approved, I could have flown and saved myself a month aboard the overstuffed vessel, but they had refused me on the grounds that novelists can write remotely, and my carbon debt from before the restrictions was still outstanding. I have never liked the sea. The introspection necessary to look at it for too long leaves me feeling hollow, as though something has been stolen from me to be lost forever beneath the weight of all that water. After a month on the ship, and surrounded by the sea on the Dulmer Peninsula, I arrived at the village of my father's birth, strongly considering breaking my sobriety at the first opportunity presented to me. The village pub had yet to open, so I instead nosed around what passed for their high street. My suitcase bounced along on the cobbles behind me as I did so, like a happy child being dragged by a bored parent. I passed a large metal fire pit in the shadow of a World War One memorial cenotaph. Ashes, soaked by rain, caked the bottom of that big dish. The people of the village were nowhere to be seen, but it was clear that Dulmer had once been filled with seasonally active businesses, which had catered to mostly domestic tourists. Those people had flocked to its enormous red sand beach. Yet the usable area of Dulmer Beach had dramatically shrunk in the last 20 years as sea levels rose. leaving the tourist-centric village with only a stripe of red sand which spent much of the day underwater. As a result, the now quiet village showed obvious signs of decay and neglect. It was clear the locals had long since stopped trying to part tourists from their cash, and pointless sun-bleached promotional signage peeled from abandoned shop windows. The first sign of life persisting in the village came a moment later when a tall and well-built man strode purposefully past me. The man carried a large stack of books and was naked to the waist. He had one of those impressive physiques, popularized by the pulp superhero movies of the noughties. Then my eyes snagged on his expressionless face. It held soft and rounded features that were at odds with his muscular bulk. "Hi, do you know what time the pub opens? I've booked a room there." The man did not acknowledge me, but I saw him unlock the pub's door and stoop his head as he stepped inside. I followed and found a musty interior, crammed with deep-set alcoves and dark wooden table sets. Empty spirit bottles lined one wall behind an ancient and notch-marked bar. The place smelt of salt wind and old beer. It was dimly lit by what sunlight struggled past the thick, dusty curtains, and still bore the yellow stains of cigarette smoke on the patchy wallpaper. The place could not possibly have seen any care for decades. "Hello?" No answer came, but I heard the sounds of the Adonis from the street storming up a creaking set of stairs. I waited. After a moment, the creaking slowly resumed, bringing with it a rasping voice. "With you shortly," a man's voice called, quavering as though a stiff breeze might silence him forever. The owner of the voice eventually emerged from the guts of the place to stand behind the bar. One of his hands clutched the muscular man's forearm, who steadied him. He was ancient and had perhaps once been obese. Loose, overlapping jowls the colour of bad ham framed his shriveled mouth, and the hand which gripped his companion looked as though it had been deflated. A simple gold wedding band dangled loosely from one of his fingers, held in place by the swollen knots of his knuckles. "What'll it be? I've a best bitter that's pulling nicely." "No, thank you. I don't drink. The name's Tunnock. I booked a room for the weekend." I let the question linger, as I had very little faith this man knew how to operate a booking site, or had regular bed and breakfast guests. "Oh, yes. Ashley, take the nice man's bag up to his room." Without a word, Ashley stepped around the bar and hefted my suitcase as though it weighed nothing. "Thank you," I stuttered reflexively, though internally I had a jolt of worry that the oversized Ashley might crush the small urn I had brought my father's ashes in. "Your son looks very strong." I reached for a pleasantry with the old man, feeling ill at ease. The geezer did not respond, and instead pulled himself a pint, which he then took big gulps of until it was drained. I made my excuses, and masking my envy, followed Ashley up to my room. The place was derelict, but the old linens on the bed looked clean. The only other piece of furniture was a small and empty bookcase by the bed, which served as a nightstand. I thanked him, but Ashley remained silent and left the room. I began to wonder if he was some manner of beautiful mute, and wondered more on the nature of his relationship with the proprietor, as I had spied a matching band of gold on his finger. I resolved to take my father down to the beach right away, and when I returned, to look up when the next bus out of that strange place might be. The old man was finishing his next pint alone as I carried the urn down the stairs and left the pub. I walked through the village again, eventually finding the right path which would take me down to what remained of the beach. I knew the tide would be going out, and I felt ready to be done with my duty. The crash of the waves grew louder as I descended a steep and poorly maintained path between the cliffs, and by the time I reached the bottom, my boots were already caked in ruddy, wet sand. Father felt heavy when I unscrewed the cap on the urn. I sprinkled him into the surf and let the tide wash him away from me. Then, the retreating water revealed a strange thing. A book half buried in the red sand. I set down the empty urn and scooped up the volume. Its spine bore no title, and I let it fall open in my hands. The writing on the pages, which should have been ruined, had remained true. I did not understand the language it was written in, but as I tried to read it, my mouth began to form words. I suddenly realized I was speaking, my voice sounding unfamiliar to my ears, and could not stop my tongue or close my mouth. I felt paralyzed, unable to move, as the words grew louder until I could no longer hear the roar of the waves. A large hand took the book from me, closing it with a wet snap which splattered sand over my face. I blinked and saw that the hand belonged to Ashley. For a moment, I thought there might be sadness in his soft features. He added the book he had taken from me to a stack of similarly sodden volumes he was carrying, and carried on down the shore, stooping every so often to pick another book up from the surf. I ran from the beach, only slowing as my legs grew weak from the steep cliff path, and I feared I might break my ankle on the loose sandy rocks. When I reached the pub, I ordered a beer from the old man and drank it whilst leaning against the bar, exhausted. It was not until my fifth pint of the horrid bitter that I felt my heart begin to calm. The locals started coming in then, and the place soon grew too loud to be comfortable for my frenzied mind. So it was that I retreated to my room with a stiff double, downed it, and got in the bed with all of my clothes still on. I think it was oblivion that took me rather than sleep, and when I awoke, it was dark. I felt the confusion of my experiences mingle with the familiar, thick-headed feeling I always used to get after a session. Orange light flickered through my window, and my curiosity dragged me out of bed to see where it was coming from. Down there, a crowd of locals were stood around the fire pit I had seen earlier, quietly warming themselves on a merry blaze. As I watched, Ashley cast more fuel on the fire, and I could see he was burning the books he had collected from the shore. It was then that I saw another face which I recognized. The man walked past the crowd of locals, and I could see from his naked frame that it was identical to that of Ashley. His face, however, was an expressionless mask stolen from my father. The lines of age had been erased, and it was perched atop that statuesque male form. The locals did not acknowledge him, but I saw him walk towards the pub, purposefully, and then lost sight of him. After a moment, I heard the stairs creak, and then footsteps coming towards my room. I felt frozen, as I had on the beach, and stared slack-jawed at the peeling paint on the door. I held my breath as the sound stopped, barely resisting the urge to hide under the bed. Then came the knock, and I knew my life would never be normal again.
What? Excuse me? Where's this baby-faced muscle man, reincarnated muscle dad, eldritch bullshit? What the fuck? I thoroughly enjoyed that because it was so deliciously weird.
It's very weird, isn't it?
It is. There was some stuff at the beginning that really threw me off of what kind of story it was going to be.
Okay.
Like, I wrote down carbon debt, cool concept. So I thought it was going to be like a future sort of soft SF thing.
Yeah.
Where it was like, oh yeah, people are only allowed to travel a specific amount, and carbon is weighed against you, and that probably is still part of that world. But it meant that I just was not expecting some kind of weird eldritch rebirth ocean book burning cult village.
Hey man, you know I like smashing SF with other weird shit.
You do.
But it's not really that SF, is it? Like that's
No.
coming. Like
Oh yeah, we're not far off.
It's not far off.
There's loads of nice little descriptors in there that make it feel very real. I think you do a good job of establishing the character as a writer, because then it means you can write in a very writerly way.
Yeah, thank you.
And
That was a deliberate thing.
And it, have it still sound like the character's voice while having all those nice turns of phrase, and like, because a lot of people wouldn't say, oh, it was a suspensionless bus, but you're telling you could say, oh yeah, it was a really uncomfortable bus journey, but suspensionless bus just tells that whole tale in 2 words.
So I would say that potentially it shows that instead of telling it, because
Yes.
it leaves the audience to fill in that would be a very uncomfortable journey.
Yeah, it paints the picture, which is
Yeah.
a show. Yeah.
Yes.
I do have a big note.
Yeah.
It's all in
Give it.
capitals. It says Ashley the baby-faced mute giant, and then there are 3 question marks.
Yeah.
Because it was, I think he's possibly introduced too early.
Potentially.
I think the old, like, if the old guy from the pub sort of spoke to him from an upper window, and then he was brought downstairs by a big baby-faced muscle man, like carrying him in his arms, that would be even weirder, and I would be very much on board for it. But
Okay. All right. I think that's a good note.
I think seeing the big muscle guy at first, you're like, oh, that's just a dude, but having it and possibly even hitting harder how youthful the face is. So
Yeah.
I
Because
think
you get
I
the
think
contrast, don't you?
you lose that a bit you get it, you drop it at the beginning when I wrote that note, but the mute stuff is really reinforced, as is his strength. But how weirdly young he looks, I think you could hit again.
Yep.
But I mean, it comes back beautifully at the end with him looking at his own dad and being like, "That's definitely my dad," but it's not, and
But it's not. Yeah.
something's wrong. Great point to end it as well with the knock on the door, and because you got to make your own decision on what the dad's going to do. Is he going to bust in there and kill him, or is he going to now be his weird manservant? We don't know.
Yeah, I thought because it's obviously some form of reincarnation, isn't it? But we can see from Ashley's behavior that for a start it's silent, and
Yeah.
it's also like mostly emotionless. Like unless you project onto it.
It can't be. I think it must be a horrible experience because
Yeah.
of Ashley taking the book away from him. Which that's a good bit of storytelling. Him just actually looking sad in that moment. It's the only time you give him any specific emotion. He's like,
So
oh, he's done it to someone else.
I'm actually not 100% sure that is. I think that might be projected sadness.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think that's a good read, and I like that read. I think it shows that there's room for more projection there as well, which is
Yeah.
interesting. But of course we already know that they are. We later learn that they are gathering the books to burn them. So it's clearly some sort of knowledge that the village doesn't want to use anymore. Like it wants to get rid of these weird books that wash up on their shore.
Yeah.
So who do you think Ashley is?
Oh. So based on the fact that that's the dad, so at the end his dad comes back, but he's got the big muscle body and he looks young. It's got to be like maybe the barkeep's husband or dad or someone. It's got to be someone who's way older than you think he is.
Mm. Yeah. So my intention was that Ashley is the barkeep's wife that died.
Okay.
And that for whatever reason this ocean like creates these like flesh golem himbos and just puts the face of the person they're reincarnating on them.
I mean, not to use an inside joke, but hunkmunculus is a thing that.
There's a strong homunculus vibe here. Yeah, I think so. I there's a lot I like about the story, but there's also a
Yeah.
lot I don't like about it. One thing is that I just can't seem to stop having ideas that are too big for this word count.
Yeah.
And I sort of thought, are you aware of how big an idea is going to be when you have it, or does it take actually taking a
I
swing at it to
I
find it?
think like 40% of the time I know,
Mm,
but it goes the other 60% gets split both ways. If I'm like, I can get a story out of this gag, and then I write 150 words, I'm like, well, that's where the punchline goes. So no, I can't.
mm,
Or the other way, when I get 1,500 words in, I'm like, well, it's starting to get good now, and I don't think I can lose much of what's already there and have the story happen. So I
yeah,
think
it's
it
tricky,
is.
isn't it?
I think it's because of it. The word count. The word count is the bit that's really challenging. Because if you had to, I could write a piece of microfiction, like smash out 200 words, and probably a good 200 words. But it's not the game we're playing.
No, No, it's
So
not.
I think, yeah, it's a good idea, but you have a habit, specifically you, because you're good with ideas, you start pulling at the threads of them, and you're like, well, I've got to explore all these threads now, and it means you end up with, instead of just an idea for a story, you end up with an idea and its baby ideas and some cousin ideas that have come to visit.
Mm.
So I don't think, I think in this case it doesn't do too much to actually impact negatively. I think a lot of things are very neat, which is very good. Um, what I would say is there's a lot of, you're doing a lot of relying on, and this is a skill, but I think some places you could expand a little bit, relying on people going, oh, he's speaking with a book. We know he's doing magic because of cultural touchstones.
Mm.
We know what a superhero body looks like, so we can give that cultural touchstone. But if it's all that, then there isn't like a nice big mouthful.
I think I know what you're talking about. In my head, I refer to that as like the oversaturation of ideas.
Yeah,
When there's so many ideas that you have to basically shorthand everything, it's not. Yeah, it can lose its flow narratively, and I often find that the stories that I struggle with the most are like that, and I end up doing a lot of not it's not quite and then this happened and then this happened, but it is very much shorthand sentence into shorthand sentence into shorthand sentence. Um, so it's definitely something that I need to work on. I think because for a few now, inside the last like 10 or 20 stories that we've written for this,
yeah,
um, I've really struggled with that because, as you said, I just keep pushing with ideas. Just on that, actually, I had
yeah.
an idea the other day, which I have followed through with, and it has helped me in other ways, in other bits of writing. But
Cool.
the classic thing where you you hear that writers get notebooks and then they just overstuff them with all the bits that just pop into your head randomly.
Yeah,
Um, I know that I think Terry Pratchett was like going around with like a duffel bag filled with different notebooks. Each one was for a different book he was working on,
that sounds
stuff
about
like
right.
that.
Yeah.
Just yeah, it is madness from a certain angle, but it's also awesome from my angle. So, um, I got a new notebook and I started writing ideas in it, but only in the right hand page. So it's a
Okay.
normal spined notebook, not a flip one.
Yeah.
And the idea is that I'm actually going to call it my drill book instead.
Okay.
And because I might get like between 2 and 8 ideas on the right hand page before it's time for the next page, different ideas.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the left hand page is whichever one of those ideas that speaks to me, I drill down into that idea on the left hand
Well,
page.
that's cool. I like
And
that a lot.
it's it, it's actually been really helpful because it allows me to sort of cut through the dross of all the ideas popping and
Yeah.
and be able to like focus on see which one I like the most and then drill down into that. And it's also an activity because you can just do the ideas bit, and then when maybe if you've got a bit of writer's block or a bit of you're not entirely sure what to do, you don't want to create anything new, you can go back to it and do the almost editorial thing of drilling down into an idea.
Yeah. It's
And I feel like I feel like I've discovered something about it, specifically the way that my brain works with this, but potentially people might find it useful as well that listen. So,
I'll give you the first thing I do when we get a prompt,
hmm
and I've not really spoken about it, but it has come up in the stories. I'm always looking for portmanteau and puns
yeah.
in the word. I mean, sometimes I've taken absolute bloody liberties with them,
Well,
but
I would say I've been fairly liberal with the prompt here. Like this is there's no clear boundary potentially between life and death or the shoreline.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, go on.
Um, but no, like this one, I'll give you an example for this prompt. I was trying to work out, because I get a punchline. I'm like, well, what's the joke for that? And it was having boundaries being the correct scientific name for part of the female breeding apparatus of the common kangaroo, because they're ovaries that you can jump around a lot with. And
Boundaries.
and I was like,
That's really funny.
is there a story in that? And it turns out there isn't. There's that joke,
Yeah,
And then what do you have? So I think I need something similar to what you've got, where I can just get the get the stupid jokes down and then go, is there a narrative that I can link to any of those?
yeah, and it's not like fully formed narratives pop into anyone's head. I don't think. Like I don't think you
Yeah,
get the full A to B story and then go right. I'll go and write this in exactly the order that it came to me.
yeah, no,
I don't think anyone's doing that. That's publishing anything. And we spoke a bit last time about taking some time to reflect on the stuff that we've learnt from our guests.
yeah,
And I think this has been a big one for me, was just trying to find how I should approach a story rather than sort of brute forcing a story,
yeah,
just how it works. Anyway, so I think that this idea of a drill book, I could thoroughly recommend this because it's working for me. Um, and I think maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll get you a notebook so you can try it and then you can report back as to whether or not it worked for you.
let's have a go.
Let's have a go.
Let's try it. Drill me.
So just to go back to your notes on that story,
Yeah,
what, like, you sort of saying like are you saying just sort of take some more words over it, or should there be things that I should cut out?
no, I don't think anything cut out, but I think it's either possibly even just moving some things around.
Well, I really like your note about moving the first introduction of Ashley.
Yeah,
I think that's good.
and so the setting I loved because it is very much like where I grew up, even though we're not in a kind of magic post-apocalypse there. It
Mm.
is a shithole with old sun-weathered ice cream signs and manky old pubs. But I think if you don't have the same touchstones for that, you could get away with a lot more like olfactory stuff because
Yeah,
there is a smell to the seaside, and especially to grim British seaside.
yeah. I think I potentially held the smell stuff for the bar, for the bit in the
Yeah,
pub. But I get you. Like that idea of decaying seaside town is deeply uncomfortable. Like I always hate it when I go to these places that perhaps for the Victorians were wonderful retreats away from the city. Um, but every time I go to them, it just feels like I'm walking through something that has died and is rotting. And it doesn't help that when you do have an overdeveloped shoreline, there is a certain stench to the sea,
yeah.
especially if a large city has grown up around that. Um, thinking about places like Blackpool Pleasure Beach,
Oh
which
god, it's awful.
I'm sure that there's lots of good things to do in Blackpool and near Blackpool and stuff, but I found going there very uncomfortable because it just didn't feel right. Um,
The
but I love being by the sea, so it's sort of like it's you want sea countryside and then inland towns. I don't think you
yeah,
want to mix the two. It gets very uncomfortable, especially when there's some sort of economic downturn, or in this case,
yeah.
ecological collapse and
I think
climate change.
I think very cinematically, generally this kind of stuff. And I think there's an almost Edgar Wrighty angle to it.
So I think I tried deliberately to steer away from that.
Yeah. But like
Um,
in my I can very clearly see him like sudden smash cut to him eating a 99 on a
mm,
bench, the urn under his arm, like having a break on the walk to the beach. It's got that feeling, and I think a bit plenty of that mundanity to make the turn even weirder might be a help. But again, you spent a lot of words on it, so I don't know if you do want to
yeah, it's a tricky one.
go too hard into that.
I think potentially a another pass in order to iron out some of those more shorthand sections, give them some more words, let it breathe a bit. It would be well beyond the word count for this podcast at that stage, so I'll have to do something
Yeah.
else with it. But yeah, no, I'm sure this story will come out somewhere else at some point.
So all a good story, like all in all, a good story because it's like I said at the beginning, I had no inkling that something strange was going to happen until we hit Ashley, and then I was like,
Yeah,
oh, that's fucking weird.
yeah,
And but it's a soft enough weird, and you did it very well in that, like, oh yeah, you know how you know how muscle people get, and just slowly drip feeding to the point that I accepted it when the Dracuna Vagoides Dracorum Satis D on the beach stuff was happening. Like, yeah, I think
That's a piece of deep lore right there.
if
Amazing.
you don't know what that is,
It's
go away and find out.
it's bedknobs and broomsticks, right?
I know you know.
Oh right, okay.
A
Yeah.
movie with the greatest line in all of Disney's lexicon, which, what's that got to do with my knob?
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at BookcaseTiny for updates. Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The Tiny Bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For magnificent beardery, let's cast the Chinicus folliculale spell on Gary Laird. For rich ginger tones on the scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne. And for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren?
How do you come up with that shit, man?